Okay, so let's get started then, right? That was the signal. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at this ongoing conversations on decoloniality and fashion, where we try new ways that's not the right thing, not the right word. Let's say the decentralized. We're trying to decentralize knowledge formulation and sharing on fashion through conversation, which I think has turned out to be quite a challenge. I think I don't know what everybody's impression is, but sometimes it feels like we've kind of like unlearned to have a true conversation in the sense of like, where everybody feels safe. I don't know if safe is the right word, but it's kind of like we unlearn to kind of like have different opinions. The whole idea of diversity, where we try to actually challenge to express different ideas and points of view. So hopefully, I mean, I see quite a few familiar faces, so that's really, really, really nice. And hopefully through time we can build this relationship where people really feel at ease, I suppose, to really question, really share ideas and a diversity of ideas and opinions. But luckily, I think also today might be quite exciting in the sense of, Japan. We're going to be discussing decoloniality and Japan. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting disruption maybe from what we have spoken about until now. But so, yeah, let's just, get a few formalities out of the way. So for those who are joining us for the first time, we have a format where we speak for about 30 minutes between the convener and our guests. And our guest today is Toby Slade, who is one of the founding members of the Research Collective. He has been with the collective for, almost 10 years now, which is amazing. And then we go into our famous breakout rooms of 5, which is always very exciting. It's a very exciting opportunity to talk to more intimately with a smaller group of people. And then we get back together and hopefully get a chance to bring back to the group some of the themes and topics that have been discussed in the breakout sessions. And we do, again, ask everybody, to be compassionate, empathic, and respectful, I guess, of everyone's journeys on how we live and experience and practice decoloniality. I mean, it's always a very special, I think, occasion, to listen to one another, to learn from one another, and to truly celebrate the diversity of the topic. So let me give the floor to Shayna. Shayna will be leading the conversation, the first part of the conversation with Toby Slade. And so I just want to remind everyone that we are recording the first part and we'll make it available through our website. So thank you, Shayna, to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Angela. And thank you, Toby, as well, for being with us. Your text on decolonizing luxury fashion in Japan was incredibly fascinating. And before we even start, I'd like to give you the space to do the Australian welcome to the country.
Yes, so it's our custom in Australia as part of a sort of an ongoing but incomplete desire for reconciliation that I'd like to begin. We begin all public meetings by acknowledging, I'm going to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation. They lived around the southern part of the Sydney Basin. And I'd like to acknowledge that they are the traditional custodians of the land and of knowledge therein. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thanks, Shayna.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And then Toby, I know when we spoke in preparation for tonight, you had some very interesting points about how you actually came to study Japanese fashion or fashion from the Japanese perspective, and having lived there for 17 years. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, certainly. I guess sort of at the very beginning, as an undergraduate student, I realized, or had a realization about the Eurocentricity of Australian art history. And at the same time, I also had a realization about the importance and neglect of research into fashion and clothing. And I also remember very clearly that there was this cliche in Australia, the cliche about Japan, and that was that Japan were excellent copyists. And that was repeated in all sorts of things. It was repeated in a business context. Oh, they make great electronics, but it was just assumed that we had invented that. And, you know, they make interesting art or popular culture, but it was always just assumed that we had invented that and they had copied. And it seemed to be this terrible, terrible model of cultural flow that was sort of perpetuated by that cliche. And I remember one of my Japanese art historians describing it in Japanese. He said, "Anata no tame ni mirai o hatsumei shimashita." It was like, we invented the future for you. And that was sort of, he was describing sort of modern art. In the analysis of modern art, the assumption of organizations like MoMA, where that simply, you know, we had invented the future for you and you're just copying us. You're copying our art, you're copying our industry, you're copying everything that we already did. We invented the future for you. And as a graduate student, I thought that applied obviously to fashion as well. We just had this assumption when we looked at Japanese fashion in the modern age, that they just copied us. And, you know, we had invented the future for them and they were just playing out our future. So as a graduate student, I set out to sort of test fashion theory in the Japanese example to see, well, to sort of disprove this. I wanted to show that what was obviously going on was not just copying, but I also wanted to establish what was universal and what was culturally specific in contemporary formulations of fashion in Japan. Now, in terms of the project we have here, which is sort of to show that the universal claims of, or the Western claims of universal validity are not universal, but are historically situated. I think I was doing that, but my project as a graduate student was a little bit different in that I'd still reserved a place for the possibility of sort of universals in the fashion of modernity, that there were certain reactions, I guess, to the technology and the social change and the economics of modernity that might have simply universally applicable forms. I guess what's so interesting about Japan and what sort of makes it a problematic example for all the things that we've been discussing in this group is that it's sort of an outlier in so many ways, but it's also, that makes it a perfect place to sort of test and nudge theory along. One of the things I think Walter said last time was this question of who created fashion. And he was inferring that fashion as a concept was a European invention. But the thing that sort of Japan reminds us is that in the Edo period, in the period when Japan had isolated itself from the world, no foreigners coming in, no Japanese going out, very, very limited trade from 1600 to 1854, which they'd done, by the way, because they wanted to kick out the Portuguese and the Spanish missionaries, and they wanted to kick out the firearms that were being sold. And so they were sort of rejecting very early attempts at colonization. But in that period, in that 250 years, Japan developed a sophisticated print media that was producing images of clothes. There was a demand for novelty. There was sexualized advertising of clothing, and not always heteronormative either. There was product placement in popular culture and kabuki and things like that. There were trends and fashions that were spoken about and written about as such. There was a utility of money. There was actually enough good stuff to buy that you wanted to work more to get more money because there was cool stuff you could purchase. And there was sort of huge resources devoted to self-styling. I think the tortoiseshell combs, which were very popular, were worth about 2 years worth of food. So there was, and everyone wanted one. Like there was this devotion to fashion in a place that had no contact or no knowledge of the fashion that was being created in Europe. So I actually think that fashion exists in all human cultures at all time. But I think this is an example not just of fashion existing, but a fashion industry, specialized elements, marketing, representation, and things like that, that had come into being in a feudal society. So when, in another colonial move, the Americans steamed into Tokyo Bay with their battleships and said, hey, you've got to open to trade, and Japan was encountering a fashion industry and a fashion system, they already had one. And so I guess the provocation there is, given enough resources, given enough sort of freedom, would all cultures develop fashion industries? Is there just something about the possibilities or the creative potential of fashion that means it's just something that comes into being once we have enough through perhaps industrialization or something like that, once we have the sort of surplus in a society where we can use those resources in this way. So I guess that was how I came at, and why I thought that Japan was such an interesting and outlying example in fashion.
So you make some very, it's so great that you use the word provocations, because you make some very quite complex provocations about modernity, and even in your text and the way that you've answered now, and you sort of use modernity in a plural sense. So it's not a modernity, it's modernities, and how modernity manifests very specifically for different places and cultures around the world, and specifically in Japan. And I know in our conversations with Walter so far, and specifically last time, he spoke about the sort of, or he raised a difference that we need to be aware of for decoloniality versus de-Westernization. And such a big part of decoloniality is, this delinking from modernity, but you do quite a good job of explaining why it's important to understand how modernity in Japan has manifested and has played out. So would you want to talk to us a bit about this sort of complex negotiation between de-Westernization and decoloniality?
Sure. I absolutely didn't want to make these oppositional or adversarial concepts. I think they sort of can be complementary, and there is, yeah, it's sort of, I didn't want it to be an academic turf war between we do de-Westernization and other people do decolonization or whatever. I think this certainly is part of the theory that we have to add when we add Asia into our theories of decoloniality, because the history of Asia is certainly very different in terms, but still absolutely and undeniably colonial to South America or Africa. Firstly, I think it's a little bit Eurocentric to think that modernity is a Western invention. I mean, the term was invented by Baudelaire to sort of describe the fleeting, ephemeral experience of life in an urban metropolis. And absolutely, the metropole that Baudelaire was in was built on the wealth of the French Empire and exploitation of culture and people and environment in that sort of a system. But in the 18th century, the biggest city in the world was Edo, in a completely isolated nation. And that would have been, I think, or had those same elements. It would have been, you know, fleeting, ephemeral experience of life in a city with over 1 million people, and that would have had certain ramifications for the way you expressed yourself, perhaps with your clothing and what clothing was available with that level of specialization, that level of sort of wealth concentration. But it was a city, Edo was a city without an empire that wasn't sort of sucking in resources. It wasn't sort of, it was still sort of feudal, which is perhaps where some of the exploitation might have been, but it wasn't built on coloniality. So I think the idea that modernity comes out of a single epistemology, or even sometimes a sort of a single critique of capitalism, I think that's wrong. I think modernity, or the way I define, it's not wrong, but I think the way I emphasize what modernity means is about that experience of that large urban space. I think, and the reason why I think that I characterize sort of Asia as having, and the world as having multiple modernities, is that I don't really think you can reverse the flow of information, the flow of sort of culture. It's modern Europe, I think, wouldn't exist without Japan. Japan, the rediscovery of Japan by Europeans in the late 19th century is the primary cause of the art of Monet and Van Gogh and all the early modernists, even Victor Horta, sort of as an architect. It's all comes from their encounter with Japanese art. And so it's almost, you could almost say that modern Europe wouldn't exist without Japan. And I also think you can say that Japan wouldn't exist without Europe. The Japan that we understand now wouldn't. And that's because I think culture is not nodal, doesn't sort of exist in one point and another point. Culture is the flow of information between people, between cultures, and it doesn't exist in the nodes, it exists in the flow. It's not a pool of information, it's a flow of information. Yeah, I think also this account of knowledge where when this whole idea of unlearning is kind of a foundational understanding of what knowledge is. It comes, and it's actually so Western because it comes from Descartes, and that you can actually go back to a single point of reasoning and establish all knowledge on top of that. So I don't think that knowledge is foundational. I don't think it's built on one point and then sort of rises up. I think knowledge is always relational. It always relies on every other bit of knowledge. So what we're sort of doing in a forum like this is not going back to the beginning and starting again. We're taking all the bits of knowledge that we already had and trying to rearrange them and rebuild the knowledge that we have. But there's this sort of metaphor of Otto Neurath and his boat. The boat is, we can't go back to shore and rebuild the boat. We can only take bits of the boat that we already have and rearrange them into different places. I've actually forgotten what your original question was. I drifted so far away from it.
I mean, there were so many interesting points in that, but we were,
No, but I think in Japan, it's quite clear that they have an alternate modernity to the Western modernity. And they're in a different place, and it was built with different imperatives and different cultural structures. It was not copying. They were not, we did not invent the future for them. They had their own future and their own modernity, their own encounter with the technology that made new fashions possible. And to sort of borrow an idea from an older argument about, there's no such thing as a socialist tractor, I think is one of the arguments about imperialism and who's copying who. There are certain technologies that made other things possible, like tractors just make more agricultural production. It makes that possible. And so I think, and I really think my argument here is that with enough resources via sort of industry and with enough freedom, I think cultures will come to fashion because fashion is so useful to communicate, to signal things, but also because fashion is beautiful. It's fun, it's joy.
So, okay. So, yeah, there's some very, very interesting points in that as well. But do you want to speak as well about just the ideas of delinking in a Japanese sense then, if we're looking very specifically at how modernity has sort of played out, because when you speak about the Edo period, I guess the point that you're making is that, in the Edo period, Japan was isolated, and according to Japan was an isolated state, and in its global isolation, fashion still existed, and in its global isolation, modernity in a large sense still existed. So it's a very big and quite profound and important point that you're making, that to assume that modernity is a Western or European or Euro-American concept is in itself a colonial sensibility. Because if we're looking at a part of the world that was completely cut off from Europe and America for a long time, all of these things that exist within coloniality, modernity, which are the crux of decoloniality, were really still happening. And in a large sense, if modernity's narrative is progression was still happening in this very isolated space and in this very isolated place and economy and political structure. And so where then do we land with delinking in the Japanese sense?
I'm sort of torn by this idea, because I think what we are really searching for here is some sort of strategy for social justice in fashion, to sort of a philosophy around which to build our activism, to stop the exploitation of cultures, to stop the exploitation of people and labor, and to stop the exploitation of the environment. And epistemological delinking is it's a great idea. And because it is attempting to remove the hierarchy of cultures on which those other things are often built. We often claim that it's okay to exploit the resources somewhere else because we are in our metropole superior, or it's okay to exploit the people of Bangladesh because we are somehow superior. We can wear the clothes that they have to make in dangerous conditions, etc. And so, but sometimes I feel that delinking implies that we can disentangle the cultures of the world. And it also sort of assumes that Japan and the West are, in the example that I have, they're sort of different nodes of culture production, whereas actually I think they're so entangled that it's almost impossible to delink. And as I said before, I think that Japan is such an important part of European modernity that you really wouldn't have had the European modernity that without Japan. So is it possible to delink? Well, as a philosophical exercise, perhaps, but as a strategy, a philosophy on which we can build activism, I'm less sure. I think the decoloniality I sort of imagine is where we just acknowledge that there are multiple modernities, multiple paths into fashion, and that was sort of a natural activity for all of humanity. I think when we spoke before, we also sort of talked about how in Japan, Western fashions were actually used to dismantle indigenous hierarchies. And so there's not just a sort of a cultural imposition of a new hierarchy. And also, by the way, were produced right up until now, sort of the first tailors that came into Japan in the 1850s were all from Hong Kong and Shanghai. So Chinese tailors producing Western clothing for Japanese people that wanted to modernize and wanted to sort of escape the feudal class arrangements of the Edo period. So if we just think of the world as a binary between the colonial and the decolonial, then we sort of miss those interesting cultural blurrings where fashion did other things, was not just an instrument for creating a hierarchy, but was maybe upsetting other hierarchies or doing completely other things. And that's kind of, I think, important too.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're sort of, getting at as well is that this idea, and I think this has for long been even something I've been grappling with as well, is this idea of actually delinking in a philosophical and intellectual sense is completely viable, but maybe in the lived literal sense is slightly utopian, maybe. And I don't want to make any, I don't want to make any projections, but it almost, I guess what you're almost getting at, especially when you're talking about the cultures and you're saying it's difficult to sort of isolate different cultures because because this exchange of cultures is already kind of happening. And so the decoloniality that you're imagining, or that you're sort of suggesting, isn't one that says, I'm going to re-isolate into my culture, because then that is again reiterating a different kind of boundary. And I think we see that happening culturally, but we also see it happening in a kind of gendered way. So if we were to say sort of, if we were to sort of say, just as a hypothetical example for femininity, if we were to take just gender as an example, if I'm to only hold onto the different parts of the things that make me a certain gender, it would then confine me within my gender. Whereas you're saying there are ways of loosening that up that don't only have to say I'm, am I understanding you correctly without having really?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Japanese had this expression in the early 20th century about the double life. And originally the double life was kind of a criticism because it implied that you weren't really modern yet, because it was talking about people that wore their suit to work, but as soon as they got home, they switched into kimono and relaxed on the tatami, because you need sort of different furniture for different clothing, and they didn't have the furniture yet to use Western clothing at home. And so it was sort of a bit of an insult. It was sort of like, you're living a double life. You're not really true to your modern ambition. But as a cultural strategy, it's actually, well, sometimes it sort of escapes the binary that we're sort of creating with colonial or decolonial. And it's simply both. You know, we had a modern aspect of our identity, and we had a Japanese one, and the Japanese one wasn't sort of just static and traditional, static and, you know, unchanging. The Japanese, there were sort of all sorts of fashions in kimono that adopted new technology and new printing or new fabrication techniques. And so, but they were also engaging with Western styles of clothing and suiting and tailoring and flapper dresses and new types of footwear and hats. So yeah, I know Japan sort of this is often held up as a great example of a culture that has been able to both modernize and prevent the erasure of a lot of its traditional culture. But
Jane and Toby, if I may, can I invite everybody to the breakout rooms now, and then we bring this back after the breakout sessions? Is that okay? I mean, I am burning in this conversation, so if we can just go to the breakout sessions and then we'll come regroup after half an hour. Thank you. Erica, can you do the magic?
I can. I'm just wondering if there's a particular kind of question that you would like for us to maybe take into the breakout room. Shana or Toby, if there's something that you'd like us to think about.
You know, initially it was the complex of decoloniality and de-Westernization. So I definitely think that is one of the points that we can take into the breakout rooms. But I think another maybe interesting provocation that we can take into the breakout rooms is, you know, what Toby's spoken about on modernity as it plays out in a localized sense and understanding very specific localized forms of modernity and hence decoloniality in very specific in specific senses.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just assign everybody to the breakout rooms. It usually takes a few minutes, and we'll see you on the other side then.